A lot of them are really deeply invested in wanting to know what God's will is, and they're really deeply paralyzed because they don't know how to figure that out. And in fact, it's almost an epidemic, a paralyzed God will seeking students.
Hey everyone, this is Yvette Hampton. Welcome back to the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. I am back today with Jonathan Brush. He is president and CEO of Unbound, and we're going to be talking about Unbound a little bit further into our discussion. But we're talking about raising kids to be adults, and it's something that, you know, as parents of young children, I remember when our first daughter was born, and as a new mom, everyone would say, "Oh, enjoy the little years; they grow up so fast." And you think, "Yeah, well, I know everybody says that." But then all of a sudden you blink your eyes and now she's 15. And I'm like,
Yes.
How in the world is that even possible? She was literally just born yesterday. I mean, it just is shocking how quickly the time goes. And we have such a short time with our kids to prepare them for adulthood. And it's an exciting time. And it's also a really hard time because there's so much responsibility that we take on, especially as homeschool parents, to prepare them for adulthood, which is the rest of their life. And though I know our kids, can make their own decisions and they can go whatever direction they're going to choose to go, we can't force them to do what we want them to do. It's still our job to be obedient to the Lord and to be diligent and do our very best to train their hearts and direct them towards the path that the Lord has set before them. And so it's a big job that we have as parents. And so I want to talk a little bit more. We talked about this in the last podcast, but I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what we should be teaching our kids in their childhood years. And, what do they need to be learning before we launch them into adulthood?
Yeah. So, I think you're asking this in a homeschool context. I know
Yes.
a lot of people listen to this are homeschoolers, of course. And so let me answer it in a homeschool context. I probably had the same problem that many of you did, right? I was homeschooled, but then I didn't know there was like this big old homeschool world. So after we had kids and we're thinking about homeschooling our kids ourselves, we went to the HEAV convention, which is our state convention here in Virginia. And there's like 16,000 people there. I didn't know there was 16,000 homeschoolers in the world, right? And so I walked in there and I listened to people and I came out and I was like, that's it. Our oldest is a daughter. I was like, Caitlin is going to speak Hebrew and Greek and do advanced algebra and finish college by 18 and like 20 things. And then a couple of years down the line, Caitlin was actually, was a great student. But, a couple of years down the line, I was like, if they're potty trained at a reasonable age and they know how to read, that would be pretty awesome. Like, in other words, the expectations kind of shift. And there's a tendency to get overwhelmed with all these extras and also to get overwhelmed with the academic side of things. And especially from the homeschooling, that's what we're doing. It's homeschooling, right? We're supposed to do academics. And I think that we've had to, as a family, really challenge that. And then I've had a unique perspective in that I have watched young adults from a regular college and then non-traditional college and from inside homeschooling and outside homeschooling, literally thousands of them I've worked with, but I've worked really closely with hundreds of them. And, we were able to see some patterns and say, it's not GPA that is an indicator of their future success. And, we can define success in some interesting ways as well. So be really cautious here. I'm not too fond of people that have magic lists. Okay. So I'm going to give you a list just to sort of help us structure our thinking, but don't get too wound up in it. Use it as a guideline for yourself. Don't take it as gospel, please. This is my observations kind of synthesized, but, pick and choose and sort of use it as a guideline for yourself. But as my wife and I think about this, we think, well, we want our students to know how to answer the big questions, and we can come back and talk in detail, which are these that are interesting. But we want our children to think in a questions paradigm instead of an answers paradigm because of the world we live in. We want to really make sure we focus on experience and skill development because ultimately that's what they'll trade for making a difference in the world and creating something of value. We want them to be good at decision making, right? Because they have to make big decisions, and technology means we have to make a lot of decisions, maybe more than people have had in the past. Now, you'll notice now we're cleared on the list, and now there's basic academics. And I define this as what do they need to know to run the republic, right? Like there's basic things I think every educated person should know. Then some of them are going to go way past that and some aren't. And I need to be chill about which is which, right? And kind of encourage the one that keeps going and not worry about the one that enough to run the republic is all they need. I distill the critical academic skills of this. Do you have the ability to quickly and effectively master complicated information, which is simply a fancy way of, are you good at learning? And if you are, I think you can figure out everything else.
Hmm.
And then the biggest one is the one at the end, which is relational skills. And so, you notice in that list of 7 things, 2 have to do with academics and the other 5 are non-academic. But my experience is that if you get that list even slightly worked on, and if you even skip the academics and you got the 5, you probably have a child who, when they became independent and adults, did fine, made a difference in the world. And I know lots of them. And so I think there's a trap there that we think, well, we have to have them great in math and they have to get a scholarship and go to college and all this kind of stuff. Maybe that's not a bad thing. But, look at these other things. And again, don't use my list as gospel. Instead, use it as a framework and say, based on your experience, what are the things that kind of, with the successful people around you, like the people you look up to, what are they good at? I bet you don't go, oh, they're fantastic at algebra. So.
Yeah, though some of them might be, if they're an engineer,
Sure.
That would be a great thing. And if you want to be an engineer, then get really good at algebra.
And if you're an engineer that designs a bridge I drive across, I really want you to be good at algebra. So, yeah, absolutely.
That's right. That's right. But if God didn't create you to be an engineer and he created you to be a mommy, it's okay to not be excellent at algebra,
Or a welder or a
Right.
farmer or, insert whatever it is that you want here. Then yes, those things may be less super essential.
Yeah. So you mentioned teaching them to answer the big questions. I want to go back to that. What would the big questions be for you and your wife that you would want your kids to be able to answer?
Yeah, this is one of those big things I think is like it drives everything, and yet it's invisible until you think about it. And then you're like, oh, yeah, that's big. So obviously, big questions in a faith context, right? Here, I characterize these big questions like, how did I get here? Why am I alive?
Yeah.
What is my purpose, and what happens when I die? There's other kind of big questions, but those are the really big ones, right? And you'll notice they're connected to faith and theology. Here's something that I tell people all the time, and my students especially have to say it a couple times, right? Everybody asks and answers those big questions. Most people do so subconsciously.
Yeah.
You cannot be alive and breathing and functioning if you haven't at some level answered this question. But most people haven't really thought about it. They're just reacting to what they think that question should be in that answer. It's an unquestioned answer.
Yes.
And almost everybody you run into has unquestioned answers about these big questions. And then, typically like 38, 40, 42, which is why we say things like midlife crisis, they all of a sudden face them and go, something's missing. These things aren't matching up. And then some bad things can happen, right? And sometimes a lot earlier than that. And so if you can help your students think about those, and look, I don't think you have to have all the perfect answers. I don't think you have to have this sewed up in a bow by the time you're 18. But if your student is aware that these questions exist and that they're aware there are answers out there that are worth examining, and they're willing to keep asking them and keep pressing into them, then I believe that the truth tells, that all truth is God's truth, and that the more they press into it, the more God reveals himself. Some students get this really, really early, and some students have to really kind of push. But, we have a faith that proposes, doesn't impose, and it's personal, which means we have to each come to it. So just because you grow up in a Christian family doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to have Christian children, right? And so just remembering that we have to teach them about those and make those conscious questions that are asked and answered instead of subconscious. You got just that right. That would be worth all your homeschooling right there, right?
Yeah.
That everything else would kind of fall in after that. You can do some other things to give your kids advantages, but if you started there and just did that, that would be enough in my experience, not just my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. My husband was talking to a young friend of his the other day. He's 18, and he's at that stage where he's like, how do I figure this out? Like, how do I figure out what my purpose is in life?
Right.
And Garrett just said, read God's word, and he's going to reveal himself to you. Like you don't, we tend to think that, I might get myself in trouble here, but all these people want to take these Enneagram tests and all the personality tests and all the things
I'll
to
get in
figure out.
trouble with you. So.
Okay, good. We'll get in trouble together. We have to take this test to figure out who we are and how God made us. And, and some of the roots of those tests are so messed up anyway, but that's a different topic for a different day. But anyway, we think, well, we've got to figure it out by someone else telling us what it is that we're supposed to be doing or who it is that we're supposed to be, instead of just looking to God's word and reading his word and saying, Lord, reveal to me through your word. Or maybe, sometimes it's through other people. Sometimes it's through our parents. Sometimes it's through friends. I mean, God uses a variety of ways and people to reveal himself to us and his plan and purpose for our lives. But it all starts with knowing him and being fully surrendered to him. And I think sometimes we miss that mark and we forget to tell our kids that it's all about surrender every day, every morning, fully surrendering. I was having this conversation with my daughter the other day and just saying, it is all about surrender. You have to surrender every day of your life, constantly, every morning. God, I am here to serve you. What is it that you want from me? And he's not going to forget about you. He's not going to be like, oops, forgot to make a plan for that one. He's got a plan for each one of us. But we need to be able to teach our kids how to figure out what God has for them. So let's take a quick break. We will be right back. Are you looking for a fantastic online math program that removes the burden of teaching math? Then Teaching Textbooks is for you. Our family's been using teaching textbooks for years, and we couldn't be happier. Our girls say that it makes learning math fun, like a game, and they love that it's interactive. Teaching Textbooks uses step-by-step video instruction and does all the grading for you. The newest version is available now with an app that even works offline. Sign up for the first 15 lessons for free at teachingtextbooks.com. That's teachingtextbooks.com. We are back with Jonathan. And before the break, we were talking about surrender. And intellectually, we can tell our kids, this is what you need to do. We need to surrender each and every day of our lives to the Lord and to figuring out what his purpose is for us. But how do we practically do that?
Yeah, I have students all the time. I get to work with a lot of homeschool students, and I really feel like I get to work with like the elite. In so many ways, they come so much better prepared than students I worked with in a more traditional education setting. And so that's pretty exciting. But a lot of them are really deeply invested in wanting to know what God's will is, and they're really deeply paralyzed because they don't know how to figure that out. And in fact, it's almost an epidemic of paralyzed God will seeking students. It's almost a stereotype now. If I homeschool a kid, they're passionate for God and they have no idea what to do, so they're stuck.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that I've taken to sort of helping unstick people is to say all that you said, Yvette, is correct about surrender and all those things. I agree with you on all those levels. There's no disagreement in that. But phrasing it a little differently and saying, translate that into asking the question. And again, this is that questions answers paradigm. So what happens is like, I want to do God's will, so I'm going to sit here and wait until I get the answer, right? But that answer often takes motion, and sometimes it takes years to unfold. I don't know that I really fully grasp what I thought I was really called to do until just the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm 44, right? I mean, and it wasn't that, but I didn't waste those other years. One like just sitting around. I'm just saying things became clear over a long time. So I tell students all the time, ask the question, keep asking the question, and then seek the answer, which involves action and moving, right? Mm-hmm. So ask the question and pray about it and seek God's will and read God's word and do all those things so you're in the right context. So you can sort out false answers and you can hear God's voice when it comes, but don't expect it to come immediately. And so keep asking the questions and keep leaning and pushing into it and discovering as you go forward. And don't think of that as like a desert, like, well, I'm just waiting and don't have anything to do. Think of that as a path of discovery. And God's going to answer you in little ways, and you're going to have some corrections, and you're going to have some failures, and you're going to have some successes, and things are going to become more and more clear. And it may be a journey. In fact, I would argue it's a lifetime journey. I say, I know a little bit about God's purpose now. I don't know that I know it fully, right? I don't expect to know it fully. I don't know, maybe the other side of eternity. Maybe it takes the rest of eternity for us to kind of fully know God, right? But it's a journey that is fun to be on. And we can contextualize it that way. Instead, it's like, I'm paralyzed until I know God's will. It's like, no. God's will, seeking God's will is a big priority. Ask the question and lean into that, and then be excited about the journey and what you'll learn along the way. Sometimes just that slight perspective shift on that important principle can change people's direction.
Well, and God, oftentimes in our life, that direction does change.
Absolutely.
God often takes us on detours. And it's not like we have to figure out, by the time we're 18 years old or 20 or 25, this is God's plan for my life for the rest of my life. And this is what I have to do.
Right.
Because as we grow in our relationship with him, as the world changes around us, I mean, we look at the last year and everything around us has changed. There are people today who have a completely different purpose in life than they could ever have imagined having 2 years ago or even a year ago, because it wasn't needed. I mean, that path wasn't necessary. And now it is necessary. And so now God has prepared them through other things in their life for a new path. And so I think as we lean into him, as you're saying, and continue to surrender, it is not a surrender once, figure out this is what God's plan is for me. And then boom, I'm off onto my
Right.
adult life. It's a constant surrender, but it's a constant willingness to change direction as God calls us to change. I mean, Garrett and we're both 46. We've been married 26 years. God has had us do many different things through our marriage. And I would never have imagined 20 years ago that we would be doing what we're doing today. I would never have imagined that we would be homeschooling. I was actually having lunch with a friend today, and she asked, how did you get into homeschooling? And so I was kind of telling her our story. I said, we were married 11 years before we had our first kid. We said we would never homeschool. I mean, we were adamant about it.
Mm-hmm.
We had every reason for not wanting to homeschool, and we thought that they were good reasons. And this was at a time in our life where we were really striving to serve the Lord and to honor him with our lives. And then he gave us children. And now we're doing a podcast and making a movie all about homeschooling. I mean, and we said we'd never homeschool. And so God uses all the different phases of our life. And as we grow in maturity in him and in his word, he changes direction with us.
And there's excitement in that when you're younger, there's only a few things that look exciting because you don't have enough experience to know what is and isn't, right?
Right.
I went to school to be a veterinary surgeon. I was going to graduate and hike the Appalachian Trail and canoe the Nile with my best friend who I'd grown up with, then get married, spend 5 years working really hard and buy a small farm. And that was my, So instead, I got married right after college. I went to work at an office job wearing a tie, which I never, ever envisioned, and lived in a subdivision after having 2 or 3 kids way fast. By 5 years, I think we were 3 kids deep or something like that, right? And was never happy in my entire life, was deliriously happy. I'm not saying everything was easy and there was no problems. I'm just saying just ridiculously over the top happy. And if somebody had told me at 18 that you'd be ridiculously happy living in a subdivision, wearing a tie, flying a desk, and having, 4 children, I'd have been like, what? And that's the thing, you don't know, right? And I wound up working in a job I didn't know existed when I went to college. I went to work for a company that did something that didn't exist when I graduated from college. And in the last year, my life has completely radically changed again. And that, if you have to prepare for that type of thing, it'll stress you out crazily. Yeah. But if instead you just lean in and ask the question and see the journey, it's a really fun roller coaster.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you talked earlier about just the pressure that's put on kids. Oftentimes we ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what do you want to do after graduation? And it's this pressure that is so unnecessary. But really what it comes down to is who really cares if they have something written down on a piece of paper or a degree in a specific thing. Now for some, maybe that is what they're meant to do. Maybe they're meant to get a degree as a doctor or a lawyer or, whatever it is that God calls them to do. That's great, but not everybody can do that. But for everyone, no matter what direction you go, staying surrendered to the Lord and being willing to listen to him is really the constant posture we need to have in living a life that honors God. For our kids, teaching them to do that, and then for us as their parents as well. So we are out of time though for this episode. We will be back tomorrow. We're going to continue this conversation. I'm really enjoying this. And tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about, I want to talk about college a little bit, kind of, what is college necessary in order to have a successful career? What does that look like? What does it look like for those who don't go to college? And I want to talk about Unbound, the ministry that the Lord has called you to, along with your family. So thank you for joining us again today, Jonathan. We will be back with you tomorrow. And thank you guys for listening. Join us again tomorrow. If you have not yet left a review for the podcast, we would love it if you would do that. Go to the iTunes, Apple podcast app. I never know what to call it. The little purple one with the little microphone on it. And we would love it if you would rate the podcast. And if you would actually leave a review, that's really helpful because that really does help encourage other people to listen to the podcast as well. So thank you for joining us. We'll be back with you tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye.